February 1st, 1956. A date that does not appear in most American history books, does not get mentioned in Cold War documentaries, and is almost never discussed in Western classrooms. Yet what unfolded on that morning, and for the 4 weeks that followed, may represent one of the most extreme climate events a modern European nation has ever been forced to survive. Not a war, not a revolution, something arguably more primal than either. But here is what makes this story genuinely unsettling. Nobody saw it coming. Not the meteorologists, not the government, not the millions of ordinary people who went to bed on January 31st expecting an ordinary winter morning and woke up inside something that more closely resembled the Siberian tundra. The question worth sitting with, the one that does not have a comfortable answer, is not simply what happened in February 1956. The harder question is what it reveals about the gap between how resilient we believe our societies to be and how fragile they actually are when nature stops cooperating. That gap existed in 1956. The argument could be made that it is considerably wider today. Let us go back to the beginning. Not to February, but to the weeks before it. Because the setup matters enormously to understanding how completely this event blindsided a nation. December 1955 was by all accounts unremarkable. Mild, even pleasant by German winter standards. Rain instead of snow. Coal furnaces running on low. The newspapers were full of stories about the economic recovery. What West Germans were already calling the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. As the country rebuilt itself from the ruins of World War II, there was optimism in the air. A sense that the worst was behind them. January 1956 continued in much the same vein. The meteorological services had nothing alarming to report. Average temperatures, normal precipitation patterns. Forecasters had no particular reason to issue warnings because the instruments and atmospheric models of the era simply could not detect what was forming at the macro scale over Northern Europe. What was forming, it would later be understood, was what atmospheric scientists call an omega blocking pattern. The name comes from the shape it traces on a weather map. A large, stable high-pressure system locked in place over Scandinavia, flanked on both sides by low-pressure troughs. It looks like the Greek letter omega. And when this configuration locks in, it does not simply influence the weather. It takes control of it completely. Under normal conditions, Western Europe is protected by its position relative to the Atlantic Ocean. Warm, moisture-laden air flows in from the west, moderating temperatures and keeping the continent habitable through the winter months. The Atlantic functions in a very real sense as a continuous heating system. But the Omega block that established itself over Scandinavia in late January 1956 acted as a wall. It did not just slow down that westerly flow, it severed it entirely. In its place, an unobstructed corridor opened up stretching directly from the Russian interior all the way to Central Europe. Cold Arctic air, the kind that normally stays confined to latitudes well above the Arctic Circle, was now pouring south and west with nothing to slow it down. Germany did not simply lose its Atlantic heating system. The window was thrown open in the middle of winter, and what poured through was air that belonged somewhere near the Ural Mountains. The change was not gradual. It happened within hours. People who were alive in Germany on the morning of February 1st, 1956, describe the experience in terms that sound almost theatrical, and yet there is every reason to take them at face value. Workers heading out for early shifts reported something that is difficult to articulate to anyone who has not experienced extreme cold. Not just the sensation of low temperature, but an almost physical violence to the air. It burned inside the nose. It locked the chest. Moisture in the eyes began to freeze before people had walked a full block. Those who wore glasses found the lenses fogged and then glazed over within seconds of stepping outside. The cars of the era, and here we should remember that these were vehicles like the Volkswagen Beetle and the Opel Capitan, built with the mechanical tolerances of the 1950s, simply would not start. The oil in the engines had thickened overnight to something approaching the consistency of cold tar. Some drivers managed to bring their vehicles back to life by running boiling water over the engine block or placing open fires beneath the oil pan. A practice that was genuinely dangerous but had become within days a routine part of morning life. Many others did not manage it at all. The public transit networks, the streetcars, the urban rail systems began failing almost immediately. Overhead lines and switches froze solid. The economic miracle that Germany had been building so carefully was suddenly running on a single engine. And that engine was sputtering. But all of that, the frozen cars, the failing trams, the burning cold, was merely the opening act. The numbers that came out of the meteorological stations over the following days are worth examining carefully, because they require a recalibration of what most people understand as cold weather. The average temperature across Germany that February was 9.6 degrees Celsius below the long-term historical mean. That is not a cold snap. That is not an unusually chilly winter. That is a complete departure from the climatic baseline. A displacement of nearly 10 full degrees in monthly average temperature. For comparison, the severe cold wave that struck Europe in 2012, which many people who lived through it still recall as exceptionally harsh, produced an average deviation of roughly 2.5 degrees Celsius. The February 1956 event was not 4 times colder than 2012. It was categorically different in nature. In the Rhine Valley, in cities like Cologne, which sits in one of the traditionally milder parts of Germany and is known for its relatively gentle winters. The monthly average temperature dropped to -7 degrees Celsius. The Rhineland was supposed to be the warm part of the country. That February, it was functioning like a freezer. In the eastern and southern interior, the numbers grew genuinely extreme. In Marienburg, in the Saxon Highlands, temperatures reached -35.5 degrees Celsius. In Waldsassen, a small town in the Upper Palatinate region near the Czech border, the thermometers registered -36.3 degrees Celsius on the night of February 10th. That figure has never been exceeded in the recorded history of the Federal Republic of Germany. It remains to this day the absolute cold record for the country. To put it in context, -36.3 degrees Celsius is colder than the average winter temperature in large parts of Alaska and central Siberia. It is a temperature at which unprotected human skin can develop frostbite within minutes. It is a temperature at which certain metals become brittle and can fracture without warning. Railroad tracks across the eastern regions were doing exactly that, fracturing. The thermal contraction stresses were simply exceeding what the steel could bear. Bridge structures groaned. Utility infrastructure began failing in ways that engineers in 1956 were not fully prepared to anticipate or address. And then there was the Rhine. The Rhine River is not simply a waterway. In the context of mid-20th century Germany, it was the central artery of an entire industrial economy. The coal from the Ruhr region moved south on the Rhine. Steel moved north. Grain, building materials, chemical precursors. The logistics of the German post-war recovery depended on this river the way the human body depends on a functioning circulatory system. The Rhine does not freeze. Not in living memory, not in the experience of anyone working on or around it in 1956. It moves too fast, carries too much volume, and the geography of its valley provides enough shelter to keep the worst cold at bay. Or so it was assumed. By early February, the first ice formations began appearing. Small flows, fragmented and drifting, nothing that would concern an experienced river worker. Within days, those flows had grown into field-scale sheets. By February 13th, the ice had stacked and compressed at the narrowing near Bingen, that where the river enters the Rhine Gorge, and it had locked solid. The Federal Maritime Authority issued the official closure. Navigation on the Rhine had ceased entirely. The photographs from those days are disorienting. People are walking on the Rhine, not on bridges. On the river itself, on thick, groaning, contorted ice that had piled in some places to several meters in height. Families with sleds. Couples out for what looks like an afternoon stroll. The images have an almost dreamlike quality. A sense that the normal rules of the physical world had been suspended. And in a sense, they had. But beneath that eerie visual spectacle, a logistical catastrophe was unfolding. Factories throughout the Ruhr reported that coal and raw material deliveries had stopped, but steel production facilities began shutting down furnaces. Not for planned maintenance, but because their supply chains had simply ceased to function. The government deployed icebreaker vessels on both the Rhine and the Danube, which had frozen solid near Regensburg as well. The flagship vessel encountered conditions beyond its operational design parameters somewhere on the Danube, became locked in the ice, and had to be abandoned by its crew while they waited for a thaw that was still weeks away. It was, in the clearest possible terms, a demonstration of the limits of human infrastructure when confronted with natural forces operating outside the range for which that infrastructure was designed. The situation inside private homes deserves its own examination because it challenges several assumptions that people living in modern, well-insulated, centrally heated homes tend to carry without examining them. The housing stock of 1950s Germany, particularly the rapidly constructed buildings of the post-war Reconstruction era, was not designed with extreme cold in mind. Single-pane glass windows were standard. Insulation was minimal or non-existent. Heat came from individual coal or wood-burning stoves, and the fuel supply for those stoves had by mid-February become severely constrained precisely because the delivery networks had broken down. The result was that the cold did not stay outside. It migrated inward, through the walls, through the window frames, under the doors. Residents began measuring temperatures inside their bedrooms. The numbers were not comfortable to read. -2 degrees Celsius inside the house, in the sleeping room. Not outdoors, inside. The phenomenon that appears most frequently in eyewitness accounts is the ice on the interior surface of windows. Not the exterior surface. That was expected. That was familiar. The interior surface. Ice crystals growing on the inside of the glass, forming elaborate frost patterns several centimeters thick, blocking the light, reducing the windows to opaque white panels. To see outside at all, residents would heat a coin on the surface of the stove, press it against the frost, and melt a small hole. A viewing port, essentially, through which they could observe a world that had gone completely still. Water pipes inside walls froze and burst. But here is the thing about burst pipes in extreme cold. They do not immediately flood. The ice itself acts as a plug, sealing the rupture. The flooding came later, during the thaw, when billions of liters of water that had been held back by ice suddenly found the open fractures in the pipes. By late February and into March, the damage that had been silently accumulating for weeks manifested all at once. Ceilings collapsed, walls soaked through. Plumbers became the most sought-after professionals in Germany. There were not nearly enough of them. Food supply during the 4-week freeze followed a trajectory that modern consumers in wealthy nations would find difficult to process. Fresh produce vanished from markets almost immediately. Refrigerated transport, which it should be said existed only in a limited capacity in 1956, was ironically useless in temperatures where the outdoors was colder than any commercial refrigeration system. The milk froze solid in its glass bottles on the backs of delivery trucks before it could reach its destinations. Bakeries reported that the ambient cold was pulling heat out of their ovens faster than the combustion could produce it. The bread simply would not bake properly. What people ate for the better part of 4 weeks was whatever they had stored in advance. Potatoes in cellars, canned goods, preserved vegetables, dried legumes. The households that had maintained the practice, still common in rural Germany at the time, of putting up substantial stores of food in autumn were the ones that came through the month without genuine hunger. The households that had not were dependent on distribution systems that were, in many areas, simply not functioning. The behavioral response to these conditions is something that historians and sociologists have studied, and the pattern they find is consistent and in some ways remarkable. The extreme cold did not produce social breakdown. It produced the opposite. Communities that had been relatively atomized, neighbors who knew each other by name but not much more, underwent a rapid and apparently organic consolidation. People checked on the elderly. People shared coal with those who had run out. There were no formal coordination systems for this. No government program. No organized charity structure. There was simply the knock on the door. Every day. Do you have enough? Do you need something? This is worth reflecting on, not as sentimentality, but as a data point about human social behavior under stress. The people who navigated February 1956 were, it should be remembered, people who had lived through the Second World War less than 15 years earlier. They had direct, embodied knowledge of what it meant to survive collective catastrophe through collective action. That knowledge had not yet faded. It was still operational. On February 25th, the meteorological instruments began showing the first tentative signs of change. A slight warming in the upper atmosphere. The Scandinavian high-pressure system was showing signs of weakening. By February 27th, the wind direction had shifted. Atlantic air was moving in again. The temperatures, which had been holding at levels more appropriate to Siberia than Central Europe, began climbing back towards zero. The thaw, when it came, brought its own category of damage. The pipe flooding described above. And also the revelation of what 4 weeks of extraordinary cold had done to the agricultural landscape. In the eastern regions of Germany, which had experienced what meteorologists call dry frost, extreme cold without snow cover, which provides no insulating effect on the soil. The ground had frozen to depths of well over a meter. When soil freezes that deeply, the root systems of perennial plants are destroyed. Orchards that had been cultivated across generations, apple trees, cherry trees, pear trees, were found in spring to be completely dead. The wood had frozen solid, the bark had split. The root systems had been killed by cold that penetrated far beyond their reach. Farmers in the affected regions faced economic ruin that extended years into the future. Because replanting an orchard is not a one-year project. The fruit trees that died in February 1956 would not have been producing commercially viable yields again until the mid-1960s at the earliest. What this event ultimately suggests. And here is where the analytical frame matters, is that the stability of modern industrial societies rests on a set of physical and logistical assumptions that are rarely examined until they are violated. In 1956, those assumptions included: rivers will remain navigable, coal will be deliverable, pipes will not freeze inside homes, Bakeries will be able to bake bread. Every one of those assumptions proved conditional. Every one of them failed. The argument is sometimes made that a contemporary society would fare better in such an event because of superior technology, better insulated homes, more robust infrastructure, more sophisticated emergency response systems. That argument has some validity, but it operates against a different set of vulnerabilities that did not exist in 1956. Just-in-time supply chains mean that modern grocery stores carry 3 to 5 days of inventory, not 3 to 5 weeks. Digital infrastructure collapses if power is disrupted. Heat pumps, which are increasingly the primary heating system in new European construction, are rated for outdoor temperatures down to roughly -15 to 20 degrees Celsius under most standard configurations. February 1956 produced temperatures of -36.3 degrees Celsius. The question of whether we are better prepared than the people who lived through that month, or worse prepared in different ways, is not one that admits a clean answer. What does seem clear is that the answer is not obviously reassuring. The atmospheric conditions that produced February 1956, that omega blocking pattern, that severing of the Atlantic westerlies, that open corridor from the Russian interior, are not classified by climatologists as impossible to repeat. They are classified as rare. The distinction between impossible and rare is one that tends to matter a great deal when it stops being theoretical. February 1956 did not end with a headline or a ceremony. It ended quietly, the way all catastrophes eventually do. With the wind shifting, the mercury climbing, the ice on the Rhine beginning its slow retreat. But the people who lived through those 4 weeks carried something with them that did not melt with the frost. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to clarity. A knowledge, while written into the body rather than the mind, of how thin the margin actually is between the ordinary functioning of civilization and its suspension. That knowledge is worth inheriting, even for those of us who never had to earn it the hard way. If this account raised questions you did not have before, about resilience, about infrastructure, about what history asks of us when we pay attention to it, then this channel is worth staying with. Every video here attempts to do what this one did. Take a story that has been forgotten or overlooked. Examine it without flinching and ask what it actually means. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if someone in your life remembers 1956 firsthand, ask them about it before that memory is gone.